Determining digital ROI. Now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. As the global ad market matures, marketers are increasingly demanding better insight about the value of every interaction and an equal focus on which consumers are really seeing online ads. As more ad budgets go online, marketers want more ROI and more accountability, leading to a greater focus on conversion to action. Today's topic is about a global trend. The technology already exists in developed ad markets and within China to deliver the information. But is the ad community here ready to handle a shift in ROI measurement that has a bigger focus on sales revenue and purchase orders? We'll find out this week on Thoughtful China from Chinese media experts like Brent Cohen and Paul McNeill. And Scott Silverman will share a thought or two about the biggest stumbling blocks to determining ROI. But first, with us is Wayne Arnold, co-founder and global CEO of the digital agency Profero. Wayne, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for having me on.
Let's start with some of the trends you're seeing globally in terms of how clients, brands are measuring ROI in the digital ad space.
So globally, everyone's still racing, as a general term, to the maximum number of impressions to be served and to claim the last click. And the reason for that is because it's quite lazy, to be honest with you. It's the simplest thing they can measure. It fits in with the reach and frequency model that they're used to from basically the traditional world. And it's not as complicated as really working out what they should be measuring, which is the true cost per human impression and actually the true value of every single action that someone's taken, so attribution. So the world's still rushing to volume, still trying to grow spend as quickly as possible. But in my view, they're focusing on the wrong things, the long-term future and growth of our industry.
But don't you find there are now more choices and the market's more fragmented than it was 5-10 years ago in terms of where they could be chasing these clicks?
Yeah, I mean, the digital world has this unusual element where there's more supply than demand. So actually you can go pretty much many places to get your metrics. And hence why you've seen the growth of the ad networks and the growth of the trading desks. But the reality is, it still comes down to how much value did that advertising create, okay, and what was the true value of that. Unless you can prove that over a sustainable period of time, the advertisers will migrate to other platforms, okay, and the customers will get annoyed.
But at the same time, if advertisers aren't demanding that companies come up and publishers come up with more and more of these tools, then who's going to drive this change?
Well, they are demanding, but they're demanding in different markets. So if you look at the mature markets where digital advertising's been around for maybe a decade plus, so particularly the UK, particularly the US, and markets in Northern Europe, like Sweden, for example, they are demanding now for a cost per human impression and a true attribution of the marketing. In markets such as in Asia and China, where it's more immature, and there's still this growth to try and get budgets from 2% to 5% to 10%, they're less demanding, mainly because, one, there's a lack of knowledge of what, let's say, could be achieved, and two, there's lack of sophistication in terms of what the tracking the media owners are willing to allow you to do, and so there's not quite that demand yet.
But as someone who runs a global agency serving clients in all these markets, is part of your job therefore to educate and bring these best practices to your clients in Asia?
Yeah, I mean, so for 15 years, we feel like we've been educating the world. From day one, trying to educate markets like Italy that never used to do ad serving because Berlusconi, and God bless him, and all those media properties he owned, it was not in his interest. So we've been on this journey for 15 years of educating the marketplace along with other players in this area. And as global players come into new markets, whether that be China or Indonesia or Thailand or Middle East, they are bringing a level of expectation of what they've bought from the West over to here. So it's happening, it just takes time, and you have to bring the media owners, the clients, and the agency talent together to be able to do that.
Talking about agency talent in general, do you find working with agencies, traditional 4A agencies, do you find that a challenge since you're more of a focus specialist in this area?
I think there's there's good agencies and bad agencies, okay, and there's good talent and bad talent. What we find is basically it is in the interest of most traditional agencies to keep the status quo. Okay, if they can keep the metrics of reach and frequency and apply the same metrics as they do for TV across to online, that's far easier than having to basically develop in a whole load of new technology, a whole load of new talent that needs to understand what's the true value of the creative or the marketing they're doing. Okay? Okay? So yes, it can be frustrating because we know what's possible, okay? But I also understand that change takes time. There's resistance to that change, and hence why I think clients and agency innovators and technology innovators like Profero and other businesses in our space have a role to play to educate the market what they can do.
It's interesting you mentioned Italy as an example where media owners, inhibited the growth of this segment for a while. Talk about your perspectives on China, because I know you had an office started here in about 2006 in Beijing. Talk about the evolution of that and some of the same, probably I would say similar media parallels here, where you would run into those challenges and how you think they can be overcome.
It's a big question, a good question. So fundamentally, when the market started, when digital grows, whether it's Italy or China, the media owners don't want to be investing heavily in technology that makes their medium accountable. Because why would you, unless people are asking for it? Why say exactly how many unique users you have when you don't have to and no one's asking for it? So what happens to start with, no one wants to do ad serving, which is the first form of accountability. Then what happens is the advertisers come in and said, I'm not going to spend with you unless you do ad serving. And the good players adopt it, they show the value they're doing, and then they move on to the next stage. So what's going to happen here, 2-3 years ago, very few players were taking ad serving as we know it, which gives you accountability of impressions and clicks. Now you're seeing that change, and a lot of the players are now taking on those tools. And the next stage is, well, actually accountability of what actually happened post those clicks, and what was the value they added to a sale, in the case of e-commerce, or how many human beings we contacted. And I'm sure later on today, with the panel or later in the discussion, people will talk about click forward and all that kind of thing. So the change will happen. It will just take time, and the question is the pace of change. My view in China is moved a huge amount in the last 2 years. It'll move again over the next 2 to 3 years, but it'll probably take 2 to 3 years to catch up to where the US and Europe is now, in my opinion.
If we're being completely honest, I mean, a big part of the value of that data, though, is how credible it is.
Yeah.
And there is a huge question here in terms of the efficacy of the data versus some of the more mature markets. How do you deal with that when you're talking to whether it's media owners or brands?
Yeah. So you have to put the caveats in. You have to basically say that realistically, this is where the market is at, okay? And then you have to apply the discounts to that. So in my view, I will pay more, our team will pay more for a media owner's impressions that is more accountable, that can give us more facts and data about what their audience is, who they are, and prove that they have not got things like click forward or, I hate the word robots, but it makes you sound like these weird people walking around clicking on impressions, than someone that can't. So I think economic drivers will drive it in the long run, but we have to be very clear and transparent with our clients what they can get at this stage and what we're trying to get for them in the future. So education, again, is a big area, and training, not just on the client side or the agency side, but also on the media owner side. Because a lot of the media owners need to be educated what can be done, what can't be done.
Wayne, thanks for being on Thoughtful China.
Thank you.
Let's take a break to hear from our sponsor. When we come back, Scott Silverman will share a thought or two about the biggest stumbling blocks to determining ROI.
Now, let's go!
Winston Churchill described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, then adding, but perhaps there's a key. That key is Russian national interest. Now, if he were a marketing director, he'd probably say the same thing about ROI. But in this case, the key would be agreement on how ROI is defined and evaluated. I think the main stumbling block to ROI is a disconnection between the campaign objective, offer, and success metrics during the briefing stage. If the objective is broad, lift awareness, lift perception, drive traffic, build responses, and sales, then the success metrics should also be broad, moving people through the decision tree rather than just transactions leading to sales revenue. With the right digital and research tools, this can be calculated, but it's just more complex than just focusing on transactions leading to sales revenue. If the objective is narrow, drive transactions and sales revenue only, the success metrics will be far easier to gauge, especially with technologies like UniClick available. But the pressure to plan and execute, that burden needs to be shared equally by the marketers and agencies during the briefing stage, before the launch. If we use a fishing metaphor, if ROI is gauged by quick transactions, the marketer must have a great offer, tasty bait, and the agency must develop great creative, sharp hook, if they expect the fish to bite. Very often, ROI, when gauged by transactions, is missing the tasty bait, sharp hook, or both. This leads to post-mortem discussions rife with finger-pointing rather than high fives. To de-enigmatize ROI, I'd reframe the acronym to ROE, Return on Expectations. This will force all parties to scrutinize the objective, offer, and success metrics up front and solve the ROI riddle by dissolving the I and resolving with an E. Cue the high fives.
Thanks, Scott. With us now in the studio are Paul McNeill, Managing Director of Sky Media, Eugene Chu, Director of Digital Strategy at JWT Shanghai, and Brent Cohen, VP International of iClick Interactive Asia. Thanks for joining us. Earlier in this episode, we heard the argument that cost per human interaction is now a viable method to measure ROI, and that all trends are moving towards this direction globally. Do you agree?
I do. Every advertiser wants to know that the money they're spending is yielding results. So if you can attribute every click all the way through to a shopping cart, it makes sense. But in China, that's not so easy to do.
Is there a country or territory that's leading this trend?
Well, this has all been pioneered in the West, in the developed markets. And it all came about when the dot-com boom became bust and everybody had to start justifying all the money they were spending online. When markets are growing, when your revenues are growing, anything you do seems to work. When things start to contract and become a little bit more restrictive, ROI, KPIs, they do matter.
And Paul, talk to us about real-time bidding. Is this something that's really taken hold in China yet? Or again, is this something that's taken hold in the West and is still in its infancy in China?
Well, in my experience, I think it's very much in its infancy here. In most cases on the digital space, the US, UK very much, maybe 3-4 years ahead. Generally takes a little while for it to catch up, partly because China's got its own individual ecosystem. The parts don't move as fast. The agencies are big and relatively slow to adapt. People are more set in their ways and don't really want to push the boat out too quickly until it's proven. And I think there's probably a lot of other reasons there as well that sort of under the surface are not quite as visible in the first place.
But the promise of real-time bidding is based on the idea that it allows you to really track and use data to analyze what customers are looking for and then respond in real time. Is that actually what's happening in China? Or do you think, as you said...
I think there's probably pockets of where it is happening. The big media agencies are all setting up their trading floors to actually be able to handle this, so they are making moves to it. But I think a lot of it's experimental, and like I said, there's a lot of moving parts here. Also on the client side, trying to push things out. They're slow to move. There's probably more nimble brands and more cutting edge brands that want to try these things out. But nobody really wants to stick the neck out unless it gets chopped off. And I think that's one of the things that everybody's got to be careful about. My point of view, it should move much faster because it should become much more transparent. I think big international companies, be it the automotive companies, the FMCG companies, these are the guys that really should be pushing it forward and demanding from their agencies and the digital partners to make it happen, because they're the ones paying for it at the end of the day.
But the publishers here are also moving. I mean, Taobao, Baidu, Tencent, they all have their own ad exchanges. So it's not just on the advertiser side. I mean, advertisers have to demand it, and the publishers have to supply it. So it's a supply and demand sort of thing.
So Eugene, let's talk about some of these clients. And do you work with any of these so-called cutting-edge clients who are moving ahead with the
Yes, we do. We have quite a few clients that are trying out this real-time bidding and audience buying. At the moment, we mostly use it for retargeting. So prospects that have come to our landing page or conversion site, they haven't converted, and then we want to have a second or third chance at trying to convince them to come back and become a lead or become a customer.
Can you walk us through that process?
So when the prospect arrives at the site, they're cookied. We have a tag that cookies them, and then after they leave our website and they go to other sites that are within the ecosystem of the real-time bidding network, basically the fact that they've been cookied identifies them as one of our prospects, and then we can serve our ads to them no matter where they go, so long as it's within the network.
So it's interesting because the topic in the West, obviously recently, has been a lot circling around privacy. And a lot of the publishers or the media companies here in China are, again, they're experimenting, but perhaps are not focusing as much on these issues of privacy.
It's not so much a privacy thing. I mean, think about it from a consumer point of view. If I am in the market to buy a car, I'm going to use a search engine to go out and find information about the brands that I'm interested in. I'm going to go to my social network and ask my friends what they're buying. I'm going to go to the website of the various manufacturers, the car companies, and then I might even go, down to the local dealer. So each step of the way there, whether it's search or display, social, even mobile, a platform like iClick, we can track all those things across those and look at the various attributes to understand what advertising works.
Well, I think the benefit to the brands and the benefit to the agencies in the middle is very clear. And obviously the benefit ultimately to the consumer is also promised. But as a consumer, they're not given the choice. So I would argue that 90% or more of customers wouldn't know that this is happening, perhaps on a conscious.
Have you ever noticed that you see a lot of car ads when you're looking to buy a car? They're there all the time. So the promise of this real-time bidding is the right message to the right person at the right time. Because from an advertising perspective, we're wasting a lot of money not getting that message. From a consumer point of view, if I get a coupon or if I get information about something that I have expressed interest in, that has value too.
So speaking of wasting a lot of money, there is an argument that traditional agencies don't yet understand, because it is in its nascency in China, how to properly bid or optimize a campaign in this way. Obviously, Eugene's mentioned that you can go back and sometimes recalibrate, but Brent, would you argue that this is something that traditional agencies struggle with?
Doing this is a full-time job. Bidding and optimization is a full-time job. The agencies have a bunch of really smart people. They get this very well. A company like iClick has a place in the ecosystem because this is what we do. And so our partners are the agencies, and we use our technology and tools to give them better intelligence, to make sure that the money is spent wisely, and ultimately to deliver better results to their clients.
Well, from an agency perspective, I think we're trying to get our heads around the technology and what it allows us to do. There's a big difference between media agencies and creative agencies. I think generally there's a move towards more full-service digital. So even for JWT as a creative agency, we're having to really become a lot smarter about data analytics and how we use that to improve our creative performance.
But to catch up to the speed of your clients' demands, does that mean having to build up those resources in-house or working with?
It's a mixture of both. I mean, we need to have people with ability to understand how media planning works, how to optimize a campaign, how to read the reports. But when it comes to the actual buying and the day-to-day management, we would work with someone like an iClick or, in our case, Media Innovation Group.
I think one of the biggest problems is the fact that the publishers don't give access to all of the data. And you need all of the data to see what works. Because if you're only limping along on bits of data, then you can make wrong conclusions based on incomplete data. Whereas in the US, you have much more access to much more open and transparency of data. The biggest problem is there's so much fake clicks going on, so much fake claims about viewership or UVs, PVs, all that sort of stuff, that once you go outside sort of second tier media, you're in a big problem, because
it's a black hole.
It's a black hole, and that's the data that you guys work with, you guys provide, but it's not complete. And to be able to make a proper ROI analysis, you need to have all the data, and it's data from the client side, everything from obviously sales, market share, brand awareness data. You need super dashboards that bring all this information in, but if the place where you're spending your money is not tracked back to the actual place delivering proper data, then all these analyses are for nothing.
Which is a bit of a paradox, because they are crippling their own ability to grow.
Absolutely, because if real-time bidding should work in the publisher's favor for the simple reason they should be able to extract the best price from the advertiser is willing to pay the most for that view, for that consumer, because a car advertiser is probably willing to pay more because it's a big ticket item than somebody selling books, for example.
But part of the trouble is that currently clients, as you mentioned earlier, they're a bit slower to move. So they're not maybe willing to question as much. And we've talked on the show before about the transparency or lack thereof.
Yeah, but first off, there's nothing that says that transparency and RTB don't also equal profits for the publishers.
Sure.
So, I think that, again, this is a supply and demand sort of thing. So as the advertising agencies, as their advertisers start to demand a little more transparency and demand more performance, just as happened in the West, it will happen here too. The whole discussion we're having today wouldn't have been possible 3 years ago. It was too early.
Right.
The fact that we're having it now tells you that it's starting to come of age.
So are these demands actually coming in greater and greater waves, or is this still a very gradual process in terms of how the industry practices are being transformed for publishers?
Well, from our perspective, we see it with performance-type campaigns, so financial services, travel and leisure.
E-commerce.
E-commerce, yeah, 5 of the 10 top e-commerce sites in China use iClick because they need to track all that. But going back to what I said earlier, as the economy contracts, as people start to watch budgets, the very first thing that gets cut is marketing.
Well, that's absolutely true, and I think it comes back to your early comment that in China, everything's been growing. Yeah, it's the Warren Buffett thing. When the tide goes out, you can see who's swimming naked. Every marketer in China thinks they're fabulous because their business is growing, their market share it may not be growing, but the actual volume they're bringing to the head office is probably quite substantial and growing compared to their peers in Europe, South America, North America. So it looks as if they're doing a good job, but it may not mean they're actually good marketers, because if they really did their job properly, China probably needs a bit of a shakeout to actually see who are the proper good marketers and who are the ones that are actually just riding the wave, are actually not very good in the first place.
And Paul, you would have expert knowledge of this because you spent quite a bit of time in China. It's over 10 years, is that correct?
10 years. That was on the back of a .com foray in 2000, which I set up an online media trading platform, which was, dare to say, a bit ahead of its time. The difference then compared to now is then technology cost quite a lot of money to develop it. But more than anything else, the people that I was trying to convince were still in the old analog era. And nowadays, I think a lot of the planners, the clients, have grown up in the digital era, so it's not a big deal to actually buy and trade online, because they do that maybe with stocks and shares, they maybe do it with other stuff. So it's very, it should make common sense that bidding and buying for media happens now compared to 15 years.
If you're a multinational customer and you come to your ad agency, you've got best practices from around the world. And you've got headquarters saying, why isn't China following the KPIs, the key performance indicators we have in these other markets? And so the local people are now saying, okay, well, we got to have that too. And so it's a matter of the Chinese market evolving to the point where we can start delivering that data.
I would disagree. I think people would tend to say, no, China's different. I remember back in the 90s, it was always Japan's different. Oh, Japan's different. Yeah, it was always the case. Everybody else saying, but Japan's different. Now everybody's saying, oh no, China's different. Of course, the ecosystem may be slightly different, but the methodologies and the actual approach and the data, it should be the same. It's just a matter of actually throwing it out there to let the guys like yourselves and like Eugene to be able to use the knowledge and the data and the tools they have to actually do a better job for clients. So I'm coming back to my earlier comment. I believe that the big advertisers should demand this change and transparency, because they're the ones they're paying for all. They're paying for all of our salaries, they're paying for the publishers, they're the ones that actually have the money. So at the end of the day, I think it should be driven by brands coming together and say, guys, this needs to happen.
There's been a few false starts in that regard. I mean, the IAB tried to start here, and advertisers have always tried to demand this kind of tracking and data. The problem is there's too many walled gardens in the Chinese media scene, and let's face it, they're protected from competition. So to some extent, it's not in their interest to be open and transparent, and the media agencies and their clients have not had that kind of power to be able to insist, unless you're a really, really big advertiser like a P&G.
But what they don't realize is they're holding themselves back. If you look at an analogy with the magazine industry in China, it's a fraction of what it could and should be compared to other markets, yeah, where magazines had probably 10% of the advertising. They've never really got above 2% here, simply because the stated readership was a factor of 5 or 10, and nobody trusts it. Nobody did auditing. So then, yeah, you tip your toes in. I've had clients that really want to be in certain magazines, and I'm trying to convince them not to go in there because I know it's basically a pile of crap you're buying. Mm-hmm. Yeah, at least with digital, you have an opportunity to be able to measure and track what's happening. But everybody has to play their part, and when there's not full transparency on data, then it still becomes an issue.
Brent, Paul, Eugene, thanks for being on Thoughtful China.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Tudo and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter and join our LinkedIn group. See you again.